Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. In this week's podcast, we're going to deal with the beginning of the story of one of the Bible's most famous prophets, Elijah. This story begins in 1 Kings 17. Out of the blue, Elijah is introduced as the Tishbite, which alludes to a place in Gilead in Transjordan. This initial episode begins with Elijah addressing the Israelite King Ahab. What Elijah has to say to the king would hardly endear the prophet to the monarch. Quite simply, Elijah asserted that the land would be arid, a lack of both dew and rain, until the prophet gave another command to reverse this pending dire situation. That's in verse 1 of chapter 17. Of course, this disturbing word would have enraged Ahab and made it necessary for the prophet to hide from the king's wrath. On cue, the Lord let Elijah know that he had to hide immediately. The divine instructions worked like a GPS. Elijah needed to leave and turn eastward, hiding out in the brook Zarephath, a place east of the Jordan River. That's in verses 2 and 3. The brook would be a source of water for the prophet, while God would instruct the ravens to provide food. Elijah was about to experience an individual event that mirrored what Israel experienced in the wilderness when they fled Egypt. Only this time, the miracle would not be manna from heaven or miraculously appearing quails. Instead, ravens were to be God's caterers in this circumstance. Elijah went to that very spot that the divine voice had commanded. Sure enough, he drank from the brook and ate bread and meat delivered by the ravens. Before long, though, the brook dried up because of the dearth of rain and, presumably, dew. That's in verses 4 through 7. That meant that Elijah would no longer have sustenance in that location. So, another divine word prompted him to go to Zarephath, a place that belonged to Sidon. Instead of ravens this time, God would see to it that a widow who lived there would make sure that Elijah had food. That's in verses 8 and 9. This means that feeding a hungry prophet is perhaps not as spectacular as having the ravens perform this task, but it is still unusual. After all, Sidon is not part of Israel. Sidon is inhabited by Canaanites, who are typically Israel's enemies. Should an Israelite prophet expect hospitality from a Canaanite widow? That seems like a rhetorical question. Still, God had instructed this widow to take care of the prophet's needs. That's in verse 9. That she would obey the Israelite God may be even more miraculous than ravens feeding the prophet. In any case, Elijah went straight to Zarephath. As he arrived, sure enough, he came upon a widow who was gathering sticks. That's in verse 10. When he approached her, he asked for a drink of water. As she went to fetch the water, Elijah made another request. He wanted her to also bring him a piece of bread. That's in verse 11. At this request, she balked. Invoking the name of Elijah's God, she admitted that her larder was almost empty. All she had was a handful of flour in a jar and a bit of oil in a cruse. As a matter of fact, she was in the process of cooking a final meal for her and her son. Afterwards, with all the food gone, she and her son would have no recourse but to give up and wait to die. That's in verse 12. The Israelite God may have told her what to do when she met Elijah, but she had no resources to meet this obligation. But Elijah had another suggestion. He told the woman not to be afraid. As well, she should go on and make him a little cake. She was to bring this to him, and then she could make a little something for her and her son to eat. That's in verse 13. Then Elijah gives her a promise with God's backing. The prophet says that the woman's access to flour and access to cooking oil would not be depleted until the time when the Lord decides to let rain fall on the land. That's in verse 14. In other words, while others might feel the effects of going without rain, she and her son would have plenty to eat. Elijah's God would guarantee this. With this new information, the widow did what the prophet asked. It turned out that the prophet ate, the woman ate, and her son ate for many days. Somehow the flour did not run out, and there was an unending supply of cooking oil. All this confirmed the word that Elijah spoke according to his God. That's in verse 16. That part of the story has a happy ending. Unfortunately, that is not the conclusion of the story. The next thing we learn is that the widow's son took ill. He got so sick that, quote, there was no breath left in him, end of quote. That's in verse 17. Whether that language meant that he was at death's door or had already died is a little ambiguous. Nevertheless, this was serious. Of course, she was angry at Elijah by this turn of events. She took the prophet's actions as a way of judging her for her sin and taking it out on her son. That's in verse 18. Elijah did not respond to her accusation. Instead, he asked the woman to give him her son. At once, Elijah took the boy into an upper chamber of the house, the very place where the child slept. The prophet put the boy on his own bed. That's in verse 19. And then the prophet talks to God. But this was no prayer for healing. Elijah was upset. He wanted to know why the Lord would punish a woman with a sick child, the very woman who had just fed him. That's in verse 20. God says nothing in response. At that point, the prophet stretched out on the child 3 times. While doing this strange ritual, he begs the Lord to bring back the boy's soul. The language used here requires a comment. The Hebrew word nephesh has typically been rendered into English as soul. But soul is a slippery word in the English language. Sometimes it simply refers to a person, such as mentioning the number of souls that were lost when the Titanic went down in 1912. However, at other times, soul is used in a Platonic sense, meaning that part of a person that is eternal and separate from bodily or physical existence. According to Plato, the soul has eternal existence, whereas the body, being material, does not last forever. For the most part, in the Old Testament, nephesh means merely person, without any distinction about what part of a person is a soul or a spirit or a body or that sort of thing. There are, though, a few times in the Old Testament where this idea of a human being consisting of body and spirit or soul seems to obtain. If we are to understand in this story that the child was dead rather than, say, comatose, this may be such an instance. On occasion, nephesh may mean something like breath as well. In any case, the Lord answered the prophet's prayer. The boy's nephesh returned, and the child revived. Again, there is some ambiguity as to whether the boy was brought back from the death or a coma. Nevertheless, the child was whole once more. That's in verse 22. At that point, Elijah took the boy back to his mother. He said to the woman, "See, your son is alive." That's in verse 23. This news elicited a response from the mother to the effect that she now realized that Elijah was a man of God, a common word for a prophet, and that the word of the Lord, using the name of the Israelite God, in his mouth was true. That's in verse 24. This episode is interesting from several angles, but let's focus on its import for this significant prophet and the ministry which he has just undertaken. Keep in mind that Elijah had been on the lam after announcing to King Ahab of Israel that a drought was about to grip the land until the prophet decided to end it. Or God would decide to end it and the prophet would announce it. Clearly, this was a judgment against King Ahab. Elijah had to get out of town after an oracle, which, to say the least, would put the prophet in the king's crosshairs. But God took care of the prophet. The deity urged him to go to a place where he could find water from a brook and where wild creatures, in this case ravens, would see to it that he had something to eat. Soon, though, the brook dried up because of the drought. That is why God had Elijah go into Canaanite territory instead. It turned out, though, that the prospects for water or food were not that great in this area either. This territory was also not exempt from the effects of the drought. Because of this dire situation, Elijah runs into a widow, a designation that automatically suggests poverty and vulnerability. And she is gathering sticks to make her a last meal for herself and her son. Of course, God had in mind that this widow could provide for Elijah. That's what he had commanded. Sure enough, Elijah asks the woman for a drink of water, which she supplies. But he also wants her to cook something for him. He promises that her flour and cooking oil will never run out if she does this. Precisely that happened. Yet we are never told how the woman responded to the fact that she had unlimited flour and unlimited supplies of oil. She says nothing about her divine mandate or what she thought about the whole matter. It is only when her child, who was either about to die or dead already, was revived by Elijah, that she proclaims her belief that he was indeed a prophet, a man of God, and that the Lord, the Israelite God, spoke the truth through him. Does this story imply that an ordinary miracle, if there is such a thing, would not confirm the prophet's status? But his bringing back a child either from death's door or even from death itself was a more impressive miracle. It is hard to say. Still, obviously the widow knew about both miracles, for she had the benefit of unending flour and unending cooking oil. And, in one way or another, presumably she knew about God's command. But that did not allow her to say anything about what she thought about the prophet at that juncture. And, of course, she witnessed Elijah's bringing her child back from death's door, or perhaps death itself. That and that alone prompted her to state positively Elijah's status as a man of God. She never utters a word about having received God's command. For now, we will let the text ambiguity along these lines remain. Let me encourage you to go to my website, faspina.com, and let me know what your email is. From now on, I'm not going to be announcing my coming mini courses because this is much more complicated than I had anticipated. So you'll hear from me next when I'm actually able to announce this as a reality. So I'm tired of doing it, and I'm sure you're tired of hearing me say this. So if you want me to answer a question in a Q&A session, email me at fspina106@gmail.com. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do two simple things. One, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. Two, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.